When Scott Erskine was sentenced to 70 years in prison for the kidnap and sexual assault of a young woman in 1993, it seemed like he was finally going to pay for a lifetime of violence against women and children. Little did people know that, while serving his prison sentence, the advancement of DNA technology would uncover even more crimes that he had committed, and they would end up being his worst offenses. This is Monsters. Scott Erskine was born on December 22, 1962 in San Diego, California to Don and Rita Erskine. He had at least 3 siblings, an older sister, a younger brother, and a younger sister. Rita would say that her husband was sex-crazed and she didn't like it, but Don told her it was her duty as his wife. It seems that Scott would go on to believe the world owed him sex as well. Rita said that Don would spank her in front of the kids, but never physically abused her in other ways in front of the kids. When the kids weren't around, though, he would punch her and throw her against the wall. When Scott was only 5 years old, he tried to cross the Pacific Coast Highway in Long Beach and was hit by a car. He was in a coma for 2 months and had a broken femur, pelvis, and several broken ribs. The doctors also reported that he had bruising on one lung and in his brain. He eventually recovered from the initial wounds, but his family said he was different after the accident. He would complain to his mother about frequent headaches that were so severe he would scream and bang his head against the wall. His mother said that he also began having sudden temper tantrums and would become violent towards his brother with no warning. He also had episodes where he would black out and have no memory of his actions. When he was 10, he was placed in a special class in his school for problem children. He also started sexually assaulting his 7-year-old sister, Judy Erskine. She would later testify that Scott and some of his friends would take her and some of her friends into the loft of the barn and force them to perform oral sex on them. She also said that 4 years later, when she was 11, she awoke to find Scott molesting her while she slept. Not long after that, Scott took one of Judy's friends into a fort he had built in the nearby woods and sexually assaulted her. Scott was admitted to a number of mental health facilities in his preteen years. He was sent to the Green Valley Ranch Youth Facility when he was 12, where a psychiatrist started treating him, but he was suddenly removed from the program by his father. Only a year later, Scott was admitted to Southwood Hospital in Chula Vista, where he was hospitalized for approximately 2 weeks in a locked ward. He was treated by Dr. Alan Rabin, who diagnosed him with dissociative neurosis, organic brain syndrome with a history of trauma, and borderline psychosis. Scott was referred for psychological testing, which showed that he had low average intellectual functioning and significant impairments in memory. He was diagnosed at that time as having an impulsive personality and hyperkinesis secondary to organic brain damage, and was prescribed medication for hyperactivity, agitation, rage episodes, and mood stabilization. Hyperkinesis is a movement disorder characterized by excessive, abnormal, and involuntary muscle activity such as tremors, tics, chorea, or dystonia. Scott was released from the facility but readmitted a year later after he committed another sexual assault. Due to the violence between various members of the family, when Scott was released again, he was sent to live with his aunt Janet Erskine in New Hampshire. The change in scenery did no good, and after Scott disobeyed his aunt's rules by bringing a girl home, she sent him back to California. After she told him her plan, he overdosed on Valium and was in the hospital for a few days before his trip back west. Back in California, 15-year-old Scott raped a 12-year-old girl at knife point, and the next day he attacked a 27-year-old jogger. The woman testified that Scott came up behind her, tapped her on the back, and then pointed a knife at her. He pulled her toward a drainage ditch, but she was able to get away from him, and eventually Scott was arrested. Since he was a juvenile at the time, his specific punishment for those crimes isn't clear, but it's been reported that he was eligible to be placed in a unit for the mentally ill. But for some unknown reason, he was only admitted to the general unit. When he was released on parole, he was placed in a foster home, but he was only there for 6 weeks before he would commit his first crime as an adult. In 1980, Scott was on his way to a job interview for a camp counselor position, something that would have given him access to unlimited victims. It's common for predators to put themselves in a position of authority over the people they want to victimize. Scott would never get the chance to use that position though, as before he arrived at his interview, he attacked a 14-year-old boy. Court records say that Scott approached the teen outside of his school asking where the restroom was. As they walked behind the main school building on the way to the restroom, Scott became quote-unquote very angry and pushed the boy against the wall. Scott violently threatened him with sexual assault, slapped his penis, and punched him in the face over 20 times. Then he sat on top of the boy and choked him until he passed out. The teen woke up to see Scott shaking him and asking him if he was all right, as though he had just found him. Scott was arrested at the scene. Scott's mother, Rita, tried to get her son placed in a psychiatric facility. She told the judge, quote, "Please give my boy some help. Otherwise, he's going to kill somebody." Despite her plea, Scott was sentenced to 4 years in prison, and while inside, he beat and sexually assaulted another inmate. Michael A. was put in a cell with Scott in January of 1981, and after an argument about a commissary purchase, Scott ordered his cellmate to perform oral sex on him and 2 other inmates. When Michael refused, Scott beat him until he gave in and performed the sex acts. A guard eventually saw what was happening and removed Michael from the cell, but it doesn't sound like Scott was punished for the crime. Scott was paroled in 1984. Once released from prison, Scott moved to Florida for a change of pace and was working at a stand in Palm Beach, Florida that sold flowers and fireworks. There he met the owner's sister, Deborah, and around 1988 the two got married. Unsurprisingly, Scott was an abusive husband, regularly beating his wife even while she was pregnant. Deborah would testify that, when she was 6 months pregnant with their son, he choked her and kicked her in the stomach. After she managed to get away, he chased her down the street yelling that he had a gun. After their son Brandon was born, Deborah left Scott and he moved back to Southern California. Once back, he continued his violence on his own family. Scott's younger brother Douglas Erskine testified that there were many physical altercations between them. Throughout 1992 alone, Scott beat Douglas with a pool cue, choked him until he lost consciousness, and in December, after an argument, Scott retrieved a rifle from his car and threatened Douglas with it. In the early 1990s, Scott worked for a company that transported cars, and that was where he met Phyllis Serrano. He ended up moving in with her in early 1993, and only a month later, on March 11th, they got into a fight that ended with Scott choking her. He was arrested, but Phyllis didn't press charges, and Scott was released. Soon, the couple were married. It's unclear where Phyllis was in October or if she and Scott were even still together, but on the 22nd, Scott met a woman named Jennifer M. at a bus stop and offered to take her back to his place for a beer. Jennifer accepted, but once inside the house, Scott choked her until she passed out, which caused her to defecate. He cleaned her, tied her up, and when she came to, he threatened her with a shotgun, forcing her to perform oral sex before raping her vaginally. When he was done, he gave her clean clothes and cooked her a steak. Then he dropped her off at the Hyatt Regency Hotel where she was supposed to meet a friend. It took her 5 days to work up the courage to report the crime, but when she did, there was still petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes from the strangulation. Scott was arrested that day, and when investigators searched his apartment, they found the yellow rope Jennifer had described being tied up with, as well as the shotgun. Scott was convicted of the kidnap and rape of Jennifer and was sentenced to 70 years in prison. On top of that, he was required to register as a sex offender, and in 1997 he was also made to give a DNA sample for the records. Though Scott Erskine was already locked up, he would soon be charged with not only one, but two more crimes, and they would be the nails in his coffin. On March 27, 1993, 9-year-old Jonathan Sellers and 13-year-old Charles Keever were riding their bikes around their neighborhood. They went to a Rally's fast food joint first and an arcade to play some video games. Then they stopped by a local pet store where they played with the dogs and cats inside. They rode their bikes to the Otay River, which runs through Chula Vista from Lower Otay Lake to the south end of San Diego Bay. The last people to see them alive were a couple of people who spoke to the boys down by the river. Another witness would come forward to say that she saw a man in a blue Volvo blocking the bike path around that time, which she thought was odd. The description of the car matched a vehicle that Scott Erskine owned at the time. It was while there that Scott abducted them, sexually assaulted them, and then murdered them. When the boys didn't return home, their parents searched and even went to the riverside path, but they were unable to locate their children. 2 days later, Peter Winslow was riding his bike along the river when he noticed a fort had been built in the nearby woods. When he peered inside, he found both boys' bodies. Jonathan's body was hanging from a tree branch by the neck, and Charles was laying on the ground. Both boys were undressed from the waist down, and they both had tape or tape residue on parts of their bodies. The medical examiner determined that they had both died from strangulation, and sexual assault kits were collected. They found a small amount of DNA, but it wasn't a match to anything in the system. The investigators had also collected 2 cigarette butts from the scene, but technology at the time wasn't advanced enough to pull a DNA sample. The case went cold, and Scott Erskine would go on to commit other crimes that would end with his incarceration and his addition to the sex offender registry. In 2001, the Cold Case Department took another look at the case and sent samples to the lab to see if they could pull more DNA with more advanced technology. They were able to build a DNA profile from the other swabs from the sexual assault kits as well as the cigarette butts. When they ran the profile through CODIS, the combined DNA index system, they came back with a match to Scott Erskine. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, with them having the special circumstance that the murder was committed while engaged in the commission or attempted commission of the crimes of performance of a lewd and lascivious act upon a child under the age of 14. He was also charged with 2 counts of use of a deadly and dangerous weapon. Scott pleaded not guilty, but his defense would not deny that he had killed the boys. Their defense was that his childhood head injury made him not responsible for his actions. Though the defense was stupid, for lack of a better word, it would make sense with all of the evidence against him. I mean, the DNA was already compelling, but he also owned a car that matched the one described in the area around the time of the crime, and his roommate at the time even confirmed that the car was in his possession on that day. The jury easily found Scott guilty of all charges, but when they got to the sentencing phase, there was one juror who wouldn't agree to sentence him to death. The judge declared a mistrial for the sentencing, and a new jury had to be brought in. As far as I understand, if the jury can't come to a unanimous decision about the death penalty, then the convicted gets sentenced to life in prison, and I'm not sure why that wasn't the case here. But the second jury voted unanimously for Scott Erskine to be executed. But that still wouldn't be the last of Scott's time in a courtroom. Before we reach the exciting conclusion of this episode, I just want to remind you that we're trying to hit 1 million subscribers this year, so before you go, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Even better, tell someone else about the channel so they could subscribe too. Then make sure you both turn on notifications so you always know when a new episode airs. You can also support the channel by checking out our merch at thisismonsters.com. A link is in the description. Your support is appreciated, and be kind to each other. Around the same time, cold case detectives were looking for the person who had killed 26-year-old Renee Baker in Palm Beach, Florida in 1989. And remember who spent some time in Florida in the late 80s? You got it, Scott Erskine. On June 23, 1989, Renee's body was discovered laying in an oyster bed near the intercoastal waterway between Palm Beach and West Palm Beach. She was nude with her clothing, purse, and necklace in a neat pile nearby. There were drag marks from some nearby bushes to where her body lay, and a cigarette butt was about 9 feet or 3 meters away. The medical examiner determined that Renee's neck had been broken, but her cause of death was drowning. The ME stated that she was either held down in the water after being assaulted, or that she was left face down in shallow water, but due to her injury she wasn't able to move. A sexual assault kit was collected and the evidence was placed in storage. It was in 2000 that a DNA profile was created from the sexual assault kit and the cigarette butt. It came back a match for Scott Erskine, but at the time, authorities believed that Scott was also responsible for the murder of a woman named Lena Tanila. When they were unable to link him to that woman's death, they moved forward with a charge of murder for Renee Baker's case. In August of 2004, Scott Erskine was sentenced to life without parole in the state of Florida. That meant that, if Scott's death penalty was reversed and somehow he was released from San Quentin Prison in California, he would then go to Florida to serve time there. Of course, that didn't happen. Scott appealed his death sentence to the California Supreme Court, who denied the appeal and upheld the sentence in 2019. Even then, it was unlikely that Scott would be executed, as there had been a moratorium on executions in the state since 2006. It wouldn't be long after his appeal was denied that Scott Erskine would die in prison anyway. On July 3, 2020, Scott died in a hospital outside of the prison of complications of COVID-19. He was 57 years old. Scott Erskine was a terror to society who would have never stopped committing evil acts against others. If he had not been connected to the murders he committed, he may have gotten out of prison on parole and went on to sexually assault and kill even more people. Fortunately, this monster operated at a time when criminals didn't worry about DNA, and science was able to catch up to him and lock him away for good. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.